Okay, I hope you feel really comfortable at this point um, creating polygon primitive objects, moving them around with the moving them, rotating them, and scaling them uniformly as whole objects by using the tools here on the left. I hope you're familiar now with the outline and how to set up different hierarchies, different groups of objects together, how to compose them into different layers to organize your scene, and also the channel box and the attribute editor. I hope you feel really comfortable using all of those tools as well as obviously navigating in the workspace. And at this point, we're going to be starting to manipulate specific components of different polygonal objects in order to really manipulate the shape to transform it into something very different than what you see here with these polyprimitives. So to do that, I want to describe what makes up an object here, what makes up the shape of a 3D object in Maya. And so we've been working so far in object mode, where when I select this cube here, I'm selecting the entire object. But this object is actually made up of different components. The next kind of component down would be this face component. So this cube is made up of 6 faces. Each one of those faces has 4 edges, and those edges are all described by 2 vertex points. If I right-click on this cube, I'm able to change what mode I'm working in, which component I'm able to work in for this object. So the default standard is the object mode, but I'm able to now change this to face mode, and now I'm able to select individual faces on my cube. And so just like I was able to transform the entire object overall in object mode using the transform tools, I'm able to now do this to individual components. And so, for example, I can, move this face in different directions to change the shape of this cube. I can scale it down. I can rotate it. I can also manipulate individual edges by right-clicking again and working in edge mode. And I'm just using those same transform tools that I've been using to manipulate the whole object. I can do this just to these particular, just to specific edges, as well as, let me delete this shape and maybe bring up something like a cylinder here. And I'm able to not only work with edges, but work with the smallest components that make up this shape, which are the vertices. And the vertices are the individual points that describe where the edges are, and then the edges describe where the faces are. Polygonal objects want to maintain either have faces that maintain either 3 or 4 sides. Anything edges, excuse me. You don't want to have any, and this is something we'll get into a little bit later, but just to be aware of it now, that polygon objects want to have either quads or tris, and you can see that here in this cylinder. So again, if I'm going to be manipulating, individual vertices here, I can just in vertex mode select my vertex, and then again translate, rotate, and scale. Although I don't think scale necessarily does anything. So for vertex mode, scale and rotate don't mean anything, but you can certainly translate in any of the different axes directions. So again, within each of these kind of ways of working, something to also be aware of, and let me go back to object mode to delete my whole cylinder there. A couple things that I want to make you aware of are that, like I said initially or in the last video, under the attribute editor here, when you create a polygon primitive, you have a tab or a node here that allows you to specify particular parameters for, in this case, how many edges, how many subdivisions around the axes and around the height of this sphere here do we have that are created. So I can, change exactly what this shape looks like using, using this node. But the minute I start to manipulate individual components, I am no longer able to access that node. That node disappears. So that's something to be aware of. Another thing, just to quickly mention, is that I have been creating these polygon primitives using the shelf, but I also can create them going under the Create menu, under Objects, Polygon Primitives. And so I, am able to specify under this option box here exactly what I want that default shape to look like if I hit this icon here. So let's say I actually don't want the default to be 20 by 20. I want the default to be, let's say, 10 by 10. And I want to apply this here. And now it's going to create every time I create a polygon, a polysphere in my scene, it's going to maintain those specifications. So that's something else to kind of be aware of. And I think lastly, I wanted to talk about these tool settings, because we started to kind of look at the different tool settings for when we were working in object mode, but you're going to want to also be familiar with using these when you're working in within different modes for components. So if I am working here, let's say in edge mode, and I'm going to select this edge right here, I am translating this edge within a world, within an orientation of the world space. Right, you can see that here. But I'm able to then change this now to component, and my axes change. So this is really useful and handy to be able to manipulate this object exactly how you want to. When working in edge mode, if I click on a single edge or double click around it, I can select an entire edge loop. And now I'm able to manipulate this entire edge loop here, which just by double clicking and then again using the kind of translate tools that I would want to use. I was using scale and then translate in the Y direction. I also can use soft selection, and be aware of when you have soft selection turned on, if you don't want to use it any longer, to turn it off. Sometimes you won't necessarily understand why all objects are moving if you see this kind of color gradient anywhere in your workspace and you're not able to select just one single object or one single component. You probably have soft selection turned on. So just be aware to turn it off or on as you need to use it. So here, I can use soft selection again, and I have my fall off mode back to volume. And let me bring this fall off much, much smaller, because my object, or the kind of sphere of influence that I'm trying to manipulate here, is a lot smaller. And let me maybe double click on this edge loop at the bottom and scale that in. And now it's scaling this one edge loop, but it's influencing the other edges around it. So this is another way that we can start to manipulate objects using this kind of soft selection as a way to not necessarily sculpt it, but it starts to kind of be able to manipulate more in a more kind of softer way the entire shape of your object. Again, if I go down to vertex mode, I can select this vertex, and using soft selection, instead of, if it's turned off, I'm just pulling this one vertice down and none of the other vertices are affected. But by using soft selection, I'm able to manipulate this object in a kind of softer way, I guess. So what I'd like you to do is start to build your scene for your first project. And in the next video, I'll kind of describe a little bit more in detail what we're kind of looking for. But what I'd like you to do now is to start to create different polygon primitives, change those parameters of those primitives, and then by working in the different component modes to manipulate those objects and to see what you can kind of create. what kind of abstracted, interesting shapes can you create in Maya just using some basic primitives and using the transform tools.